William Thompson's coffee mug stopped halfway to his lips. The desperate howling outside his main cabin carried the same pitch as his son's last cry 3 years ago. The blizzard hadn't sounded like that before midnight. Now it sounded like death itself, calling through the December darkness. Through his frosted window, something impossible moved against the white. A shadow dragging another shadow, leaving a crimson trail that disappeared as fast as the snow covered it. The grandfather clock in the corner ticked 11:47 p.m., the exact time his world had shattered on that icy road. His wife Margaret's voice echoed from memory. "Some storms bring angels, William, even when they look like demons." The howling stopped. Silence pressed against the cabin walls like a held breath. Then came the scratching at his door, deliberate, urgent, desperate. 3 soft thuds against the wood. William's hand trembled as he reached for the door handle, knowing that whatever waited outside would either save him or destroy the last pieces of the man he used to be. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 years ago, Dr. William Thompson had been a man who believed in second chances. His veterinary clinic in Portland had been filled with the laughter of children bringing in wounded birds and the grateful tears of families whose pets he'd saved. Margaret would meet him at the door each evening with stories of their 8-year-old son Tommy's latest adventure, and their modest home had hummed with the quiet contentment of a life well lived. The accident happened on December 15, 2021 at exactly 3:47 a.m. Black ice on Route 1, a semi-truck running a red light, and in an instant, William's world collapsed into twisted metal and silence. Margaret died on impact. Tommy lived long enough to whisper, "Daddy, fix me," before the monitors went flat. William walked away with nothing but a scar across his left temple and the crushing knowledge that all his medical training meant nothing when it mattered most. After the funerals, he'd sold the clinic, donated their belongings, and retreated to this isolated cabin in the Maine woods that Margaret had inherited from her grandfather. The place sat on 40 acres of pine forest, miles from the nearest neighbor, connected to the world only by a rutted dirt road that became impassable in winter. It was the perfect place for a man who wanted to disappear. The cabin still held echoes of Margaret's presence, her reading glasses on the kitchen windowsill, Tommy's drawings taped to the refrigerator, family photos that William couldn't bring himself to pack away. The grandfather clock in the living room had stopped at 3:47 a.m. the day he'd arrived, and he'd never bothered to fix it. Time felt irrelevant when you had nowhere to be and no one waiting for you. For 3 years, William had maintained a routine of survival, chopping wood, tending a small garden in summer, and reading medical journals by lamplight, though he couldn't say why he bothered keeping up with a profession he'd abandoned. He spoke to no one except the occasional supply delivery driver, and even then, only when necessary. His voice had grown rusty from disuse. The townspeople in nearby Millbrook had given up trying to draw him back into society. They'd heard about the accident, understood his grief, and eventually learned to respect his desire for solitude. Dr. Sarah Chen, who'd taken over pediatric cases at the regional hospital, had stopped by twice in the early months, offering to talk or simply sit in silence. Both times, William had watched her car disappear down his driveway without opening the door. Now, standing in his cabin with the December wind rattling the windows and something desperate crying outside his door, William felt the weight of those 3 years pressing against his chest. His medical bag sat unopened in the bedroom closet, gathering dust alongside the man he used to be. His hands, once steady enough to perform surgery on a sparrow's broken wing, now trembled as they reached for the door handle. Outside, the crying had stopped, replaced by an ominous silence that made the winter night feel suddenly alive with possibility and dread. William's hand froze on the door handle as another sound reached him through the howling wind, not the desperate crying he'd heard before, but something softer, more fragile, a whimper that seemed to come from something very small and very cold. His medical instincts, dormant for 3 years, stirred like embers touched by oxygen. He yanked the door open, and the winter night slammed into him with brutal force. Snow whipped across the threshold, and the temperature drop hit his lungs like ice water. But it wasn't the cold that stopped his breath. It was the sight of what huddled on his porch. A German shepherd, massive even in its collapsed state, lay trembling in the snow. Its thick coat was matted with ice and something darker, blood that had frozen into crimson streaks along its head and shoulders. But what made William's chest tighten was what the dog protected beneath its body, a bundle of pale blue fabric that moved with the faint rhythm of labored breathing. The dog raised its head as William appeared, and he found himself staring into eyes the color of Arctic ice, unusual for the breed, almost luminous in the porch light. Those eyes held an intelligence that was unmistakably human in its desperation. The animal was trying to communicate something urgent, something life or death important. William knelt slowly, his medical training taking over despite 3 years of rust. "Easy," he whispered, his voice cracking from disuse. "Let me see." The dog shifted slightly, revealing what it had been protecting. A baby, no more than 6 months old, wearing only a thin onesie that had once been white, but was now stained with cold and neglect. The infant's lips had a blue tinge that made William's stomach drop, hypothermia, and advanced. The child's breathing was shallow, irregular, the kind of respiratory distress that meant minutes, not hours. "Jesus," William breathed. His hands moved automatically, checking for a pulse at the baby's tiny wrist, weak but present. Core temperature dangerously low. The child needed immediate warming, needed shelter, needed medical intervention that William wasn't sure he could provide anymore. The dog watched every movement with those startling blue eyes, never relaxing its protective stance but allowing William access. When William carefully lifted the baby, the dog struggled to its feet, swaying but determined to follow. Its left hind leg dragged slightly, an old injury that had healed wrong. Inside the cabin, William's dormant medical instincts roared to life. He grabbed blankets from the bedroom, started a fire in the wood stove, and created a makeshift warming station on his couch. The baby, a girl, he realized, was barely conscious, her tiny body frighteningly still in his hands. "Come on, sweetheart," he murmured, rubbing her limbs gently to encourage circulation. "Stay with me." The dog collapsed near the fire, steam rising from its wet coat. Now William could see the full extent of its injuries, a gash across the skull that had bled significantly, multiple abrasions along its flanks, and something in its posture that spoke of trauma beyond the physical. This animal had been hurt, and recently. As William worked to stabilize the baby's temperature, wrapping her in layers of warming blankets and positioning her near the fire's heat, he found himself talking. The first real conversation he'd had in months. "Where did you find her?" he asked the dog, who watched his every movement with unwavering attention. "How long were you out there?" The baby's breathing began to strengthen as her core temperature rose. Color crept back into her lips. William checked her over methodically. No obvious injuries beyond exposure, though she was severely dehydrated and malnourished. She needed medical attention beyond what he could provide here, needed a hospital and proper pediatric care. But something stopped him from reaching for his phone. Maybe it was the way the dog positioned itself between William and the door, as if guarding against some unseen threat. Maybe it was the child's peaceful expression as she finally slipped into what looked like natural sleep rather than hypothermic unconsciousness. Or maybe it was the first stirring of purpose William had felt since the accident, the familiar weight of responsibility for another creature's life. He looked at the dog, who had managed to stop shivering but still watched him with those intense blue eyes. "You saved her life," William said quietly. "Whatever happened out there, however you found her, you kept her alive long enough to get here." The dog's tail moved once, a barely perceptible wag that seemed to acknowledge the praise. But its gaze remained alert, worried, as if it expected something terrible to come crashing through the door at any moment. William realized he was faced with a decision that would shatter the careful isolation he'd built around himself. He could call the authorities, hand over the baby and the dog, and retreat back into his protective solitude. It would be the safe choice, the rational choice. But as he watched the baby sleep peacefully for the first time in what was clearly days, and saw the way the injured dog refused to rest despite its obvious exhaustion, William felt something crack open inside his chest. It was a feeling he'd thought died with Margaret and Tommy, the fierce, protective instinct that made a person willing to fight against impossible odds. Outside, the blizzard continued to rage, but inside the cabin, 3 broken creatures had found shelter together. The grandfather clock still showed 3:47, but for the first time in 3 years, William didn't hear it ticking. Instead, he heard the soft breathing of the baby, the gentle panting of the dog, and underneath it all, the whisper of his own voice saying words he hadn't spoken since the accident. "I won't let anything happen to you. I promise." Dawn crept through the cabin windows like a reluctant witness, casting pale light across the makeshift medical station William had created in his living room. The baby, he'd started thinking of her as Emma, though he had no idea if that was her real name, had slept peacefully through the night, her breathing steady and strong. The dangerous blue tinge had faded from her lips, replaced by the healthy pink of proper circulation. The German shepherd, whom William had begun calling Rex, after noticing the faded letters on a torn collar buried in his matted fur, lay watchful beside the couch. Despite his obvious exhaustion, the dog hadn't allowed himself more than brief moments of rest, his ice-blue eyes constantly scanning the room as if expecting threats to materialize from the shadows. William stood at the kitchen window, holding a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, staring at his cell phone. The rational part of his mind insisted he should have called authorities hours ago. To Child Protective Services, the Sheriff's Department, someone equipped to handle abandoned babies and injured animals. But every time he reached for the phone, Rex would shift position, moving closer to Emma with a protective intensity that made William hesitate. The decision was made for him when headlights appeared through the trees, growing larger as a vehicle navigated the treacherous road to his cabin. William's stomach clenched as he recognized the familiar blue sedan, Dr. Sarah Chen's car, the same one that had sat in his driveway twice before, waiting for an invitation that never came. Rex was on his feet instantly, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The dog positioned himself between the couch and the door, his hackles raised despite his injuries. Whatever had happened to him, Rex had learned to fear unexpected visitors. "Easy, boy," William murmured, though his own pulse had quickened. "She's a friend, I think." Sarah's knock was soft but persistent. "William?" "I know you're in there. Mrs. Henderson from the general store saw your lights on all night. She was worried about you in this storm." William approached the door slowly, acutely aware of how he must look after 3 years of isolation, unkempt beard, hollow cheeks, clothes that had seen better decades. But when he opened the door, Sarah's expression held no judgment, only the warm concern he remembered from their brief encounters years ago. "I brought supplies," she said, lifting a medical bag that looked remarkably similar to the one gathering dust in his closet. "Just in case you needed—" Her words died as she caught sight of Rex, bloodied and vigilant, and then Emma sleeping peacefully on the couch. "Dear God, William," What happened here? The story came out in fragments as Sarah examined both patients with the quiet efficiency William remembered from their professional interactions years ago. She cleaned Rex's wounds while William held the dog steady, marveling at how the animal seemed to understand they were trying to help. The head injury was concerning but not life-threatening, a clean cut that suggested a deliberate blow rather than an accident. "Someone hit him with something heavy," Sarah said grimly as she applied antiseptic. "Recently, within the last day or two. And look at this." She pointed to faded scars along Rex's flanks, old wounds that had healed badly. "This animal has been systematically abused." Emma's examination revealed better news. Malnourished and dehydrated, but without signs of serious injury. Sarah estimated she'd been without proper care for at least 2 days, possibly longer. "She's lucky that dog found her," Sarah said, gently checking Emma's reflexes. "Another few hours in that cold and we would have lost her." As Sarah worked, William found himself remembering why he'd been drawn to medicine in the first place. The quiet satisfaction of healing, the profound intimacy of trust between caregiver and patient. For the first time in 3 years, his hands felt steady, his mind clear and focused on something beyond his own grief. "We need to report this," Sarah said finally, packing away her supplies. "Both the abandoned baby and the animal abuse. There are protocols." "No." The word came out sharper than William intended. Rex's ears perked up at his tone and Emma stirred restlessly on the couch. "Not yet." Sarah studied his face with the same careful attention she'd given her patients. "William, I understand you've been through hell. We all know what happened to Margaret and Tommy. But you can't just keep a baby because you found her. And that dog needs veterinary care beyond what we can provide here." "Look at him," William said, gesturing toward Rex, who had moved to lie protectively beside Emma's makeshift bed. "He's not going to let anyone take her. Whatever happened out there, whoever hurt him, he sees her as his responsibility now." As if to prove William's point, Rex lifted his head and fixed those startling blue eyes on Sarah. There was no aggression in his gaze, but there was an unmistakable message. The baby was under his protection, and he would not be moved from that duty. Sarah sank into William's armchair, suddenly looking as exhausted as he felt. "There's something else," she said quietly. "I've been treating other animals lately, dogs mostly, with similar injury patterns to this one. Always the same story. Found wandering, traumatized, signs of systematic abuse. Someone in this area is running an operation, and they're not just training dogs. They're breaking them." The words hit William like ice water. He thought of Rex's flinching response to sudden movements, the way the dog's whole body tensed at unexpected sounds. How many? 7 in the last 6 months. All German shepherds or similar breeds. All showing signs of professional training that's been corrupted into something else. Sarah's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "William, I think someone is stealing trained dogs and using them for something terrible, and I think your Rex escaped from whoever's doing it." Outside, the wind had died down, leaving an ominous quiet that seemed to press against the cabin's windows. Rex raised his head suddenly, ears swiveling toward sounds only he could detect. A moment later, William heard it too, the distant rumble of a truck engine, growing closer. "Are you expecting someone?" Sarah asked, but William was already moving toward the window. Through the trees he could see a dark pickup truck navigating the rutted road with the confidence of someone who had driven it before. Rex was on his feet again, the hair along his spine standing straight up. A sound escaped his throat that wasn't quite a growl, something deeper, more primal. The sound of an animal recognizing a mortal enemy. Emma began to cry as if sensing the sudden tension that filled the cabin. Rex moved immediately to her side, his massive body forming a barrier between the couch and the approaching vehicle. Sarah reached for her phone, but William caught her wrist. "Wait," he said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Let's see what they want first." But even as he spoke, William knew with cold certainty that whatever was coming up his driveway wasn't here for a social visit. Rex's reaction made that clear enough. Someone was coming for the dog, possibly for the baby too, and William realized he wasn't prepared to let either of them go. The truck's engine shut off, and footsteps crunched through the snow toward his door. The knock on William's door came 3 times, deliberate and measured, like a man accustomed to having doors opened for him whether he was welcome or not. Rex's entire body went rigid, his ice-blue eyes fixed on the entrance with an intensity that made the hair on William's arms stand up. The dog's reaction wasn't just fear, it was recognition mixed with primal terror. "Dr. Thompson?" The voice carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "I'm Marcus Webb. I believe you have something that belongs to me." William exchanged a glance with Sarah, who had positioned herself protectively near Emma's makeshift bed. The baby had stopped crying but remained restless, as if sensing the tension that filled the cabin like smoke. William moved to the door but didn't open it. "I'm not sure what you're talking about, Mr. Webb." "I think you do." There was steel beneath the polite tone. "I run a dog training facility about 30 miles north of here. One of my animals escaped during the storm last night. German Shepherd, distinctive blue eyes. My understanding is he may have ended up here." Rex let out a sound that was barely audible. Not quite a whimper, not quite a growl. It was the sound of an animal reliving a nightmare. Sarah placed a gentle hand on the dog's head, and William saw her face pale as she felt the tremor that ran through Rex's entire frame. "Even if I had seen such a dog," William said carefully, "I'd want to see some proof of ownership before turning over any animal, especially one that appears to have been injured." The silence that followed stretched long enough for William to hear his own heartbeat. When Marcus spoke again, his voice had shed all pretense of civility. "Dr. Thompson, I don't think you understand the situation here. That animal is dangerous. He's been involved in an incident that resulted in serious injuries. For the safety of everyone in this community, he needs to be returned to my facility immediately for proper containment." "What kind of incident?" Sarah called out, her voice carrying the authority of her medical training. "I'm Dr. Chen from Millbrook General. If there's been an animal attack, I need to know the details for public health purposes." Another pause. William could hear Marcus shifting his weight on the porch, the creak of old boards under heavy boots. "The dog attacked a child, Dr. Chen. A little girl. She's in critical condition at Portland Medical Center." The words hit William like a physical blow. He looked at Rex, who was now pressed against Emma's couch, his body forming a protective barrier around the sleeping baby. The idea of this gentle giant attacking a child seemed impossible, but doubt crept in. What did he really know about this dog beyond the fact that he'd brought Emma to safety? "I'll need to see documentation," William said finally. "Medical reports, police filings, your facility's licensing information?" "Of course." Marcus's tone turned reasonable again, though William detected an undercurrent of impatience. "I have everything in my truck. But Dr. Thompson, while we're handling paperwork, that animal could be a threat to anyone in the vicinity, including that baby you're harboring." The casual mention of Emma sent ice through William's veins. There was no way Marcus could have seen inside the cabin from the porch, which meant he'd been watching them, had been aware of the situation before he'd even knocked. Sarah must have reached the same conclusion. She moved closer to the window, careful to stay out of sight while peering through the curtains. "William," she whispered, "there are 2 more men by his truck, and they have equipment." "What kind of equipment?" "Catch poles? Tranquilizer guns?" "The kind of gear animal control uses for dangerous captures." Rex heard the word tranquilizer, and his reaction was immediate and visceral. He scrambled to his feet, positioning himself between the door and Emma, his hackles raised and lips pulled back to reveal impressive canine teeth. But it wasn't aggression, it was pure terror. The dog was having a panic response to something that triggered deep trauma. "It's okay, boy," William murmured, but Rex was beyond hearing. His breathing had become rapid and shallow, and William realized the dog was having what could only be described as a panic attack. "Marcus Webb," Sarah said suddenly, her voice sharp with recognition. "I know that name. He used to be a police officer in Portland. Lost his son in some kind of accident a few years back." The pieces began falling into place with horrible clarity. William remembered reading about it in the local papers. A police officer's child killed in a dog attack, the officer's subsequent breakdown and dismissal from the force. If Marcus Webb was running some kind of training facility now, it made sense that it might not be the legitimate operation he claimed. "Mr. Webb," William called through the door, "I'm going to need you to leave my property while I verify your claims. If you have legitimate ownership of this animal, the proper authorities can sort it out." "I'm afraid that's not going to happen, Dr. Thompson." The pretense was completely gone now. Marcus's voice carried the cold efficiency of someone who had moved beyond negotiation. "That animal has information that could compromise an ongoing operation. And the baby, well, let's just say her presence here creates complications that need to be resolved." William felt Sarah grab his arm, her fingers digging into his flesh with urgent pressure. "He knows about Emma," she whispered. "This isn't about the dog. They're here for both of them." Outside they could hear movement. Boots on gravel, the metallic click of equipment being prepared. Rex's panic had transformed into something else entirely. The terror was still there, but underneath it was a growing determination. The dog was positioning himself for a fight he knew he couldn't win, but one he was prepared to lose to protect the baby behind him. "Dr. Thompson, you have 30 seconds to open this door voluntarily. After that, we'll be coming in anyway, and I can't guarantee everyone's safety." William's mind raced through possibilities. The cabin had no back exit, and the windows were too small to escape through with a baby and an injured dog. His cell phone sat uselessly on the kitchen counter. Even if he could reach 911, help was at least 20 minutes away through the storm-damaged roads. "Sarah," he said quietly, "there's a shotgun in the bedroom closet, top shelf behind the medical supplies. Do you know how to use one? My father taught me to hunt." Her voice was steady despite the tremor in her hands. "But William, if they have tranquilizer guns—" "I know." He looked at Rex, who had stopped trembling and now stood with the focused stillness of a soldier awaiting orders. "But we're not giving up without a fight." The sound of splintering wood made the decision for them. Marcus wasn't waiting for his 30 seconds to expire. The front door exploded inward, revealing a man in his late 40s with the build of someone who maintained police fitness standards despite leaving the force. His gray eyes swept the room with tactical precision before settling on Rex. "There you are, you bastard!" Rex's response was immediate and startling. Instead of cowering or attacking, the dog began to bark, not the wild barking of an aggressive animal, but a specific pattern of sharp, controlled sounds. William realized with shock that Rex was giving some kind of signal, a trained response that had nothing to do with fear or aggression. "Shut him up!" Marcus snapped to one of his men, who raised a tranquilizer rifle with practiced ease. "No!" William stepped between the gun and Rex, his own voice carrying an authority he hadn't felt in 3 years. "You're not taking either of them." Marcus studied William with calculating eyes. "Dr. Thompson, you don't understand what you're interfering with here. That dog isn't just a trained animal. He's a witness to activities that certain people would prefer remained private. And the baby—" He gestured toward Emma, who had begun crying again. "Let's just say her mother won't be coming to look for her." The implication in those words made William's blood run cold. "What did you do?" "I didn't do anything, doctor. But sometimes people make poor choices, and those choices have consequences. The girl got involved with things she shouldn't have, and when she tried to leave with evidence that could hurt important people—" Marcus shrugged. "Accidents happen, especially to drug addicts driving in bad weather." Sarah had returned from the bedroom, shotgun in hand, but held low to avoid escalating the immediate situation. Her face was pale as she processed Marcus's words. "You killed her mother. I told you, Dr. Chen, accidents happen. The important thing now is cleaning up the loose ends. The dog knows too much, and the baby, well, she's evidence of relationships that need to remain private." Rex's barking had changed again, becoming more urgent, more desperate. William suddenly realized what the dog was trying to communicate. He wasn't barking at Marcus or his men. He was barking toward the back of the cabin, toward something only his keen hearing could detect. A moment later, William heard it too. Sirens in the distance, growing closer. Rex hadn't been having a panic attack earlier. He'd been trying to signal for help, using training that ran deeper than the abuse Marcus had subjected him to. Marcus heard the sirens too, and his expression darkened. "Seems like we'll need to accelerate our timeline." He nodded to his men, who raised their weapons with grim efficiency. "Last chance, Dr. Thompson. Hand over the dog and the baby, and maybe you and Dr. Chen get to walk away from this." William looked at Rex, who had stopped barking and now stood with quiet dignity beside Emma's couch. The dog's ice-blue eyes met his, and in them William saw something he recognized from his own mirror in the years since the accident, the look of someone who had lost everything that mattered and found one last chance at redemption. "Go to hell," William said quietly. Marcus smiled, but it was the cold expression of a predator who had cornered his prey. "I was hoping you'd say that." The first tranquilizer dart whistled past William's ear and embedded itself in the wooden wall behind him with a soft thunk. Rex lunged forward with a speed that belied his injuries, his massive frame colliding with the nearest gunman and sending the man crashing into the doorframe. The tranquilizer rifle clattered across the floor as Rex's jaws clamped down on the man's arm, not to maim, but to disarm. "Rex, release!" William shouted, and to his amazement, the dog immediately let go and retreated to Emma's side, his training overriding even his protective instincts. Sarah raised the shotgun with steady hands, her father's hunting lessons coming back to her in the space of a heartbeat. "Everyone stop moving right now." Marcus held up a hand to his remaining man, his gray eyes calculating the new dynamic in the room. The sirens were getting closer, maybe 5 minutes out, possibly less. But 5 minutes was an eternity when armed men were threatening a baby and an injured animal. "Dr. Chen, you don't want to escalate this situation," Marcus said, his voice taking on the reasonable tone of a hostage negotiator. "We're not here to hurt anyone. We just need to contain a dangerous animal and resolve a custody issue." "Custody issue?" Sarah's voice cracked with incredulous anger. "You just admitted to killing that baby's mother." "I admitted to nothing. I simply pointed out that drug addicts often have accidents." Marcus's smile was cold as winter steel. "And even if something unfortunate did happen to the girl, Dr. Chen, you have no proof of anything beyond the word of a traumatized veterinarian who's been living as a hermit for 3 years. William felt something snap inside his chest, not breaking, but clicking into place like a bone that had been set wrong and finally aligned properly. For 3 years he'd been running from responsibility, from connection, from the possibility of losing someone else he cared about. But looking at Rex standing guard over Emma, seeing the dog's willingness to face certain pain to protect an innocent life, William realized he'd been living as a coward. "You're right about one thing, Webb," William said, moving slowly toward the kitchen counter where his cell phone lay. I have been traumatized. I've been broken, isolated, afraid to care about anyone because I couldn't bear to lose them again. Marcus tracked his movement but didn't try to stop him yet. Then you understand. But you know what I've learned in the last 12 hours? William continued, his hand closing around the phone. Sometimes the thing you're most afraid of losing is exactly what makes life worth living. He hit the record button on his phone's video camera and held it up so the lens captured Marcus and his men. So go ahead, Mr. Webb. Tell me again about the accidents that happen to people who get in your way. Tell me about your training facility and what you do to dogs like Rex. Marcus's face darkened as he realized what William was doing. Turn that off. Or what? You'll shoot me in my own cabin while Dr. Chen is holding a shotgun and the police are on their way? William's voice grew stronger with each word. I don't think so. I think you're going to start talking because this is being live-streamed to my social media accounts, and by now, half of Millbrook is watching. It was a bluff. William's phone wasn't actually live-streaming anything, but Marcus didn't know that. The former police officer's training warred with his desperation, and for a moment the room balanced on a knife's edge of tension. Rex made the decision for everyone. The dog's acute hearing had picked up something the humans couldn't yet detect. The sound of multiple vehicles approaching fast through the snow. His tail moved once, a barely perceptible wag that somehow communicated hope. The cavalry's coming, Marcus, Sarah said, her shotgun never wavering. Time to decide whether you want to be here when they arrive. Marcus looked at his injured man, still nursing his arm where Rex had grabbed him, then at his remaining gunman, then at the phone in William's hand. The calculation was swift and brutal. He nodded to his men. We're leaving. But Dr. Thompson, this isn't over. That dog has seen things, knows things that could hurt important people. People with long memories and longer reach than mine. Then maybe those people should have thought about that before they started abusing animals and killing young mothers, William said. Maybe they should have remembered that some of us still believe in protecting the innocent. Marcus paused at the broken doorway, his gray eyes fixing on Rex one last time. You think you've won something here, don't you? But that animal will never be safe. None of you will. We'll be back, and next time we won't be so polite about it. The threat hung in the air like smoke as Marcus and his men retreated to their truck. Through the window, William watched them drive away just as the first police cruiser appeared through the trees, followed closely by an ambulance and what looked like the sheriff's department's tactical response vehicle. Rex collapsed beside Emma's couch, his adrenaline finally giving way to exhaustion and pain. The dog's breathing was labored, and William could see that the confrontation had reopened some of his wounds. Emma, as if sensing the danger had passed, finally stopped crying and fell into what looked like peaceful sleep. We need to get him to a veterinary hospital, Sarah said, kneeling beside Rex and checking his pulse. He's gone into shock. The stress of the confrontation, combined with his existing injuries, William was already reaching for his jacket. There's an emergency animal clinic in Portland. If we can stabilize him for the drive, William, Sarah's voice was gentle but firm, you can't drive to Portland in this weather with a critically injured dog and a baby. It's too dangerous. The first responders were at the door now. Sheriff Deputy Jake Morrison, a young man William recognized from town but had never spoken to, along with 2 EMTs and what appeared to be a state police detective. Dr. Thompson, we received reports of armed men threatening civilians at this address. Deputy Morrison's eyes took in the broken door, the tranquilizer dart still embedded in the wall, and the unusual tableau of man, woman, dog, and baby. Are you injured? Is anyone hurt? William looked at Rex, whose ice-blue eyes were glazing with pain and exhaustion, then at Emma, sleeping peacefully despite the chaos around her, then at Sarah, who had stood with him against impossible odds without hesitation. We're alive, he said finally, but we need help. All of us? The next hour passed in a blur of statements, medical examinations, and careful documentation. The EMTs confirmed that Emma was stable but needed hospital observation for malnutrition and exposure. Rex required immediate surgical intervention for his reopened wounds and potential internal injuries from the stress response. But it was Deputy Morrison who provided the most crucial information. A young man barely out of the police academy, he had the earnest dedication of someone who still believed the system could work if good people made it work. "Dr. Thompson, we've been investigating reports of illegal animal trafficking and abuse in this region for months," he said, reviewing his notes. "The description you gave of Marcus Webb matches a suspect we've been trying to locate. If you're willing to testify about what happened here today." "I'll testify," William said without hesitation. "And I have video evidence." Morrison's eyes lit up. "You recorded the encounter?" William handed over his phone, scrolling to the recording he'd started during the confrontation. "Everything from the moment they threatened us to the moment they left, including Webb's admission about Emma's mother." As Morrison reviewed the footage, his expression grew grim. "Dr. Thompson, this is exactly what we needed. But you should know, these people don't give up easily. You and Dr. Chen may need protection until we can make arrests." William looked at Rex, who was being prepared for transport to the veterinary hospital, and at Emma, whom the EMTs were carefully bundling for the ride to Portland Medical. 3 hours ago, he'd been a hermit with nothing to lose. Now he had a family to protect. Unconventional and fragile, but real. "Deputy Morrison," he said, "do whatever you need to do. But I'm not running anymore, and I'm not letting anyone hurt them." Sarah touched his arm gently. "William, there's something else you should know. I've been thinking about what Marcus said about Emma's mother and the evidence she might have had. If this trafficking operation is as large as it seems, there might be other victims, other dogs like Rex, other babies like Emma." The weight of that possibility settled on William's shoulders like lead. He thought about Rex's trained responses, the way the dog had known to signal for help. How many other animals were suffering in Marcus Webb's facility? How many other families had been destroyed? "Then we stop them," he said simply. "Whatever it takes, we stop them all." Through the window he could see Rex being loaded into the ambulance, the dog's blue eyes still alert despite his pain. Emma was secure in her carrier, surrounded by medical equipment that would monitor her vital signs during transport. Both of them were alive because they'd found each other, and because William had finally remembered what it meant to fight for something bigger than his own grief. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed, and William realized it was running again, marking time that moved forward instead of standing still in an endless loop of 3:47 a.m. Somehow, in the chaos of the last day, time had started moving again, and for the first time since the accident, William was ready to move with it. 3 days later, William sat in the sterile waiting room of Portland Veterinary Hospital, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with the relentless persistence of institutional indifference, and the antiseptic smell reminded him of the night Margaret and Tommy had died. The same helpless vigil, the same crushing weight of waiting for news that might destroy what remained of his world. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't alone. Sarah dozed fitfully in the chair beside him, her head resting against his shoulder. She'd refused to leave despite having her own patients to attend to, claiming that Emma needed continuity of care and Rex needed advocates who understood his trauma. The truth, William suspected, was that Sarah understood his trauma too, the particular agony of loving something fragile in a world designed to break beautiful things. Emma slept peacefully in her carrier between them, her breathing steady and strong. The pediatric team at Portland Medical had worked miracles with IV fluids and careful nutrition, bringing her back from the edge of malnutrition and dehydration. But it was Rex she reached for when she woke, her tiny fingers grasping at air until someone brought her close enough to touch the dog's fur through the carrier's mesh. The surgery had taken 6 hours. Internal bleeding from stress-induced complications, infection in the head wound that had gone deeper than anyone initially realized, and damage to old fractures that had never healed properly. The veterinary surgeon, Dr. Amanda Foster, had been blunt about Rex's chances. "Honestly, Dr. Thompson, I'm amazed this animal survived whatever was done to him. The systematic nature of his injuries, this wasn't accidental abuse. Someone deliberately and methodically broke this dog, physically and psychologically. The fact that he still has the capacity for protective behavior, for trust, for love, it's nothing short of miraculous." The waiting room door opened with a soft whoosh, and Deputy Morrison entered, his young face grave with the weight of information William wasn't sure he wanted to hear. Behind him walked a woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to delivering difficult truths. Detective Linda Rodriguez from the State Police. "Dr. Thompson, Dr. Chen." Morrison nodded to each of them as Sarah stirred awake. "We have updates on the investigation if you're ready to hear them." William set down his coffee cup, noting how his hands remained steady despite the tension coiling in his chest. 3 days ago, he would have been trembling. Now he felt the centered calm of a man who had found something worth fighting for. "We found Marcus Webb's facility," Detective Rodriguez said without preamble. 23 dogs in various stages of abuse and trauma. German Shepherds mostly, but also Belgian Malinois, Dutch Shepherds, all breeds with high intelligence and strong protective instincts. Sarah's intake of breath was sharp enough to wake Emma, who began to fuss softly. William reached for the baby automatically, a gesture that had become natural over the past 3 days, and Emma settled immediately at his touch. "The conditions were significant," Rodriguez continued, her professional vocabulary barely containing obvious disgust. "Dogs kept in isolation chambers designed to break their spirits. Systematic starvation, electric shock training, forced aggression protocols. We've documented everything for the prosecution." "What about Marcus himself?" William asked, though part of him wasn't sure he wanted to know. Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "That's where things get complicated. Webb wasn't at the facility when we raided it. According to his employees, the ones who agreed to cooperate, he left the night of the confrontation at your cabin and hasn't been back. So he's running." "More than that," Rodriguez said grimly. "We believe he's been operating this facility as part of a larger network. Dog fighting rings, private security contracts that required broken animals, even some connections to human trafficking operations that used trained dogs for intimidation." The words hit William like cold water. He looked down at Emma, sleeping peacefully in his arms, and wondered what kind of world she would inherit. "You're saying this goes beyond animal abuse?" "Much beyond. Dr. Thompson, when you saved this dog and this baby, you didn't just rescue 2 victims. You potentially exposed an operation that's been destroying lives, human and animal, for years." Sarah leaned forward, her medical training engaging with the investigative details. "What about Emma's mother? Have you found any evidence about what really happened to her?" "Jennifer Walsh, 22 years old, died in a single car accident on Route 1 during the blizzard," Rodriguez recited from her notes. But the accident reconstruction team found something interesting. The car went off the road at a point where there were fresh tire tracks, multiple vehicles, suggesting she was being followed or possibly forced off the road. William felt the familiar rage building in his chest, but this time it was focused, purposeful, not the helpless anger that had consumed him after Margaret and Tommy's deaths, but the righteous fury of a man who had found his cause. "What about the baby? Emma's legal status?" Morrison consulted his own notes. "Jennifer Walsh has no listed next of kin except for a father she'd been estranged from for several years. based on the evidence we've gathered that Father appears to be Marcus Webb himself." The revelation hit the waiting room like a physical force. Sarah's hand found William's arm, squeezing tightly as the implications settled around them. Emma stirred in William's arms, making the soft, cooing sounds that had become familiar over their 3 days together. "So Marcus was trying to reclaim his own granddaughter," William said slowly, "after potentially killing his own daughter." "That's our working theory," Rodriguez confirmed. Jennifer had been living with an abusive boyfriend who was connected to Webb's operation. When she tried to leave with evidence that could have exposed the network, both she and the boyfriend became liabilities. And Emma? According to the cooperative witnesses, Webb saw the baby as both a loose end and an opportunity. He could either eliminate the evidence she represented or use her as leverage against other potential witnesses. William looked down at Emma's sleeping face, imagining the calculation that could view this innocent child as either a threat to be eliminated or a tool to be exploited. The thought made his arms tighten protectively around her small form. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. "To Emma? To Rex? To all of this?" Detective Rodriguez exchanged a glance with Morrison before answering. "That depends partly on you, Dr. Thompson. The district attorney wants to offer you and Dr. Chen protective custody until we can round up the rest of Webb's network. As for the baby," she paused, choosing her words carefully. "Child Protective Services is involved now, obviously, but given the circumstances and given that you've been her primary caregiver during this crisis, there's a possibility of emergency foster placement while the investigation proceeds." "And Rex?" "The dog is evidence in a criminal case, technically. But given his trauma and his bond with the baby, the state veterinarian is willing to approve a supervised rehabilitation placement with someone qualified to handle both his medical and psychological needs." The offer hung in the air between them, heavy with possibility and responsibility. William looked at Sarah, seeing his own thoughts reflected in her eyes. 3 days ago, he'd been a broken man living in isolation, convinced that caring for anyone was a luxury he couldn't afford. Now he was being offered the chance to build a family from the fragments of tragedy, not a replacement for what he'd lost, but something entirely new. "Dr. Foster wants to see you." A nurse appeared in the doorway, interrupting the moment. "Rex is awake, and he's asking for you." William handed Emma to Sarah and followed the nurse down the corridor, his heart hammering against his ribs. The recovery room was dimly lit, designed to be calm and non-threatening for traumatized animals. Rex lay on a padded table, his head wrapped in clean bandages, IV lines running from his front leg, but his ice-blue eyes were alert and focused, tracking William's movement across the room. "Hey, boy," William said softly, approaching slowly. "How are you feeling?" Rex's tail moved once against the table, not quite a wag, but an acknowledgement. When William placed his hand gently on the dog's head, Rex leaned into the touch with a trust that seemed impossible given everything he'd endured. "Dr. Foster says you're going to be okay," William continued, his voice rough with emotion. "It'll take time, and there'll be hard days, but you're going to heal." Rex's eyes seemed to understand more than just the words. In them, William saw the same choice he'd been forced to make 3 days ago, whether to retreat into protective isolation or risk everything on the possibility of love. "And I want you to know," William whispered, "you're not going through it alone. Not anymore. We're family now, all of us. You, me, Emma, Sarah. We're going to take care of each other." For the first time since the night Rex had appeared on his doorstep, the dog's tail wagged properly, a full, enthusiastic sweep that spoke of hope finally allowed to bloom. Outside, snow was beginning to fall again, but William no longer heard it as a threat. Instead, it sounded like the quiet blessing of a world being made clean. The truth came in pieces. like a jigsaw puzzle assembled by trembling hands in poor light. It began with a phone call at 2:17 a.m., 6 weeks after Rex's surgery, 6 weeks after Emma had started sleeping through the night in the crib. William had assembled in what used to be Margaret's sewing room. Detective Rodriguez's voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had been chasing ghosts through a labyrinth of corruption and found something worse than she'd imagined. "Dr. Thompson, we need to talk. All of you. Can you come to the station this morning?" William had been feeding Emma her bottle, Rex lying protectively beside the rocking chair that had once belonged to his grandmother. The domestic tranquility of the moment, the baby's contented suckling, the dog's gentle breathing, the soft tick of the grandfather clock that now kept proper time, felt suddenly fragile, like a soap bubble about to burst. "What did you find?" he asked, though part of him didn't want to know. "More than we bargained for, much more." The state police headquarters in Augusta felt like a fortress designed to contain terrible knowledge. Sarah had closed her practice for the morning to join them, and they sat in a sterile conference room that smelled of industrial coffee and the peculiar anxiety that permeated all government buildings. Emma dozed in her carrier, blissfully unaware that her very existence had unraveled a conspiracy that reached far beyond Marcus Webb's dog training facility. Detective Rodriguez spread photographs across the table like a dealer shuffling cards in a game where the stakes were measured in destroyed lives. Images of dogs, dozens of them, in various stages of abuse and training. But these weren't all from Webb's facility. "We've identified 17 separate operations across 6 states, Rodriguez began, her voice clinical but her eyes haunted. "All connected through a network of buyers who used traumatized dogs for specific purposes. Dogfighting is just the beginning. Private security firms that wanted animals guaranteed to be vicious. Drug dealers who needed dogs that would attack on command without hesitation. And worse." Sarah leaned forward, her medical training engaging with the systematic horror being described. "How worse?" "Human trafficking operations that use the dogs to control victims. The more broken the animal, the more effective the intimidation." Rodriguez pulled out a different set of photographs. Young women, teenagers, some barely older than children. "These are some of the victims we've identified. All of them reported being terrorized by dogs that had been specifically trained to associate certain behaviors with violence." William felt the familiar rage building in his chest, but now it was coupled with something else, a cold, calculating fury that demanded justice rather than vengeance. He looked at Rex, who had been allowed to accompany them to the station as part of his therapy program. The dog's ice-blue eyes were alert but calm, no longer flinching at sudden movements or unexpected sounds. "Where does Marcus Webb fit into all of this?" "Webb was middle management," Rodriguez said grimly. "A regional coordinator who had both the expertise to break dogs effectively and the law enforcement background to avoid detection, but he wasn't running the show." She pulled out a final photograph, a surveillance shot of a man in an expensive suit shaking hands with Marcus outside what appeared to be an upscale restaurant. The man was older, silver-haired, with the kind of polished appearance that suggested money and power. Richard Blackwood, 62 years old, owns a chain of private security firms across the Northeast. Legitimate businesses on the surface, but they've been providing specialty services to clients who needed problems solved quietly. "And Jennifer Walsh?" William asked, thinking of Emma's mother, the young woman who had died trying to escape this nightmare. Jennifer was Webb's daughter, but she was also Blackwood's employee. She'd been working at one of his facilities, thought she was helping with legitimate animal training. When she discovered what was really happening, she tried to document it. That's when she became a liability. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. Jennifer had discovered her father's involvement in systematic animal abuse and tried to expose it. When she attempted to leave with evidence, both Webb and Blackwood had marked her for elimination. The car accident that killed her had been as deliberate as everything else in this carefully orchestrated horror. "What about Emma?" Sarah asked, her voice tight with protective concern. What was she to them? Rodriguez hesitated, and William knew the answer was going to hurt before she spoke. Blackwood saw potential in the bloodline. Webb's genetics, combined with early trauma exposure, could have produced what they called a generational asset, someone raised from infancy to accept violence as normal, to work within their operations without questioning the methods. The conference room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and Emma's peaceful breathing. William tried to process the idea that these people had looked at an innocent baby and seen a future tool for inflicting suffering. The calculation required a kind of evil that transcended ordinary criminal behavior. "But they miscalculated," Rodriguez continued. "They didn't account for Rex." She pulled out one final document, a veterinary report from Webb's facility dated 3 days before Rex's escape. The clinical language barely concealed the systematic torture that had been inflicted on him. Electric shock conditioning, isolation stress protocols, forced aggression training designed to break his protective instincts and replace them with indiscriminate violence. According to the facility records, Rex was scheduled for termination the night he escaped. He'd proven unsuitable for conditioning. He kept trying to protect other animals instead of attacking them. But somehow he heard Jennifer's baby crying in that abandoned house where she'd hidden Emma before her final escape attempt. William looked at Rex, seeing the dog not just as a victim who had survived, but as a hero who had chosen to act despite everything that had been done to break his spirit. The dog's response to that crying baby hadn't been conditioned or trained. It had been purely moral, the irreducible core of goodness that no amount of abuse could destroy. "So he saved her," William said quietly. "He saved her, and then he brought her to you. Out of all the houses in Maine, all the people who might have helped, somehow he found the one person who understood exactly what it meant to lose a family and would fight to protect a new one." Sarah reached across the table and took William's hand, her fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that had become natural over the past 6 weeks. They'd been building something together, not just a relationship, but a family constructed from the fragments of tragedy and held together by conscious choice rather than biological accident. "What happens now?" she asked. "Blackwood and 17 of his associates were arrested this morning in coordinated raids across 6 states. We've recovered over 200 animals and identified 43 human victims. The prosecution is calling it the largest animal abuse and human trafficking network ever uncovered in the Northeast." "And Marcus?" Rodriguez's expression darkened. "Still missing. But we'll find him. He's got nowhere left to run, and too many people who want to see him answer for what he's done." As if sensing the conversation was about Emma's future, the baby stirred in her carrier and began to fuss softly. William reached for her automatically, the gesture so practiced now that he didn't think about it. Emma settled immediately against his chest, her tiny hand grasping his finger with surprising strength. "There's one more thing," Rodriguez said. "The district attorney wants to know if you're prepared to testify in the trials. All of them. Blackwood, Webb when we catch him, and potentially dozens of others. It could take years, and it means staying in the public eye, dealing with media attention, possibly facing threats from people connected to the network." William looked at Sarah, then at Rex, then down at Emma's peaceful face. 6 weeks ago, the thought of that kind of exposure would have terrified him. The idea of standing up in courtrooms, facing cross-examination, having his private grief dissected by defense attorneys, it would have been unthinkable. But that was before he'd learned what it meant to be part of a family again, before he'd discovered that some things were worth fighting for, even when the fight seemed impossible. "Yes," he said simply, "we'll testify, all of us, if necessary. Rodriguez smiled, the first genuinely warm expression William had seen from her. "I was hoping you'd say that, because Dr. Thompson, what you did that night, choosing to protect Rex and Emma instead of turning them over to Webb, it didn't just save 2 lives, it broke open a criminal enterprise that was destroying hundreds of lives. You're heroes, all of you." William shook his head. "Rex is the hero. We just followed his lead." As if understanding the conversation was about him, Rex rose from his position by the door and approached William's chair. The dog's movements were still careful. His injuries had healed, but the physical therapy was ongoing. But there was a dignity in his bearing that spoke of recovered confidence. Rex placed his head gently against Emma's back, and the baby turned toward him with the instinctive trust of a child who had never known a world where this dog wasn't her protector. The image they made, man, woman, baby, and dog, was a portrait of the kind of family that couldn't be planned or purchased, only discovered in moments of crisis when people chose to save each other. "There's something else," Rodriguez said, her tone shifting to something more personal. "The state has offered to fund Emma's medical care and education through a victim compensation program. And there's been interest from publishers, documentary filmmakers, people who want to tell this story." "We're not interested in profit from this," Sarah said firmly. "I know. But the visibility could help other victims come forward, could prevent this from happening to other families. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to let evil operate in darkness." William considered this, thinking about all the other dogs like Rex, all the other babies like Emma, all the other families like his own that could be destroyed by people like Blackwood and Webb. The prospect of media attention still made him uncomfortable, but the thought of remaining silent while others suffered was unbearable. "We'll think about it," he said finally. "But first we want to go home. We want to be a family, quietly, normally, for a while." As they prepared to leave the police station, William realized that the word home had taken on new meaning. It wasn't just the cabin where he'd hidden from the world for 3 years. It was wherever the 4 of them were together, Rex watching over Emma, Sarah building a medical practice that specialized in trauma recovery, William slowly learning to trust in happiness again. The grandfather clock in his living room now kept perfect time, but William had finally learned the difference between marking time and living it. Time wasn't just something that passed. It was something you filled with love, with purpose, with the conscious choice to build rather than retreat. And as they drove home through the Maine countryside, Emma sleeping peacefully in her car seat and Rex watching the world pass by with calm, alert eyes, William understood that they were no longer victims of the past, but authors of the future. 2 years later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of what had once been William's hermit cabin and was now unmistakably a family home. Emma's toys were scattered across the living room floor, wooden blocks and soft animals that Rex had learned to retrieve without damaging. The grandfather clock in the corner chimed 8 times, marking not just the hour, but the rhythm of a life that had found its proper tempo. William stood in the kitchen, preparing Emma's breakfast while watching through the window as Rex supervised the toddler's exploration of their backyard. At 18 months, Emma was fearless in the way only children could be, tottering across the grass with the absolute confidence that her 4-legged guardian would keep her safe. Rex had appointed himself her personal security detail, never more than 3 feet away, his ice-blue eyes constantly scanning for potential threats that existed now only in his rehabilitated memory. Sarah emerged from the bedroom, her hair still damp from the shower, wearing scrubs that bore the logo of the Thompson-Chen family practice. 6 months ago, they'd opened their clinic together, William handling veterinary cases while Sarah focused on pediatric medicine, with a specialty in treating children who had experienced trauma. The waiting room was designed to accommodate both human and animal patients, acknowledging that healing often happened best when families could stay together. "Any word from Detective Rodriguez?" Sarah asked. Accepting the coffee William handed her with the casual intimacy of two people who had learned to navigate morning routines together. "She's supposed to call this morning. Today's the day they sentenced Blackwood." The trials had stretched across 18 months, a parade of testimony that had exposed the full scope of the trafficking network. William had testified in 4 separate proceedings, each time standing before juries and describing that December night when Rex had appeared on his doorstep. The defense attorneys had tried to paint him as an unreliable witness, a grief-stricken hermit whose isolation had made him paranoid. But the physical evidence was overwhelming, and the other victims who had found the courage to speak had created an undeniable pattern of systematic abuse. Marcus Webb remained at large, though sightings had been reported from Mexico to Canada. Interpol had taken over the search, but William had made peace with the possibility that Webb might never face justice in a courtroom. Some forms of accountability, he'd learned, came from sources beyond human law. Through the window, he watched Emma toddle toward the garden fence, where a small memorial stood among Margaret's restored flower beds. 2 headstones bore the names of his first family, but beside them stood a newer marker. Jennifer Walsh, beloved mother, brave soul. They'd fought Child Protective Services for the right to keep that connection alive for Emma, to ensure she grew up knowing that her birth mother had died trying to protect her. "Daddy, Rex Flower," Emma's voice carried across the yard as she pointed toward the memorial. The dog had developed a habit of lying beside Jennifer's marker each morning, as if keeping a promise that transcended the boundaries between species and life and death. William stepped outside, his feet finding the familiar path across grass that was green again, tended by hands that had remembered how to nurture growing things. Rex looked up as he approached, tail wagging in the gentle rhythm that had replaced the anxious stillness of his rescue days. "Good boy," William murmured, kneeling to scratch behind the dog's ears. Rex leaned into the touch with complete trust, a transformation that still amazed the veterinary behaviorists who studied his recovery. According to their professional literature, dogs subjected to the kind of systematic abuse Rex had endured rarely regained the capacity for normal bonding. Yet here he was, not just bonded but protective, not just healed but heroic. Emma toddled over and threw her small arms around Rex's neck, a gesture the dog accepted with the patient dignity of a grandfather tolerating an enthusiastic grandchild. She babbled something that might have been good dog, or might have been her own private language, but Rex understood perfectly. His tail wagged harder, and he gently licked her cheek, earning delighted giggles that filled the morning air with the sound of pure joy. The phone rang from inside the house, and Sarah's voice called out that it was Detective Rodriguez. William scooped up Emma and headed back toward the house, Rex padding alongside them like a faithful shadow. "Dr. Thompson?" Rodriguez's voice carried satisfaction mixed with exhaustion. "Richard Blackwood was sentenced this morning. Life without parole on the federal trafficking charges, plus concurrent sentences on state charges. He'll never see freedom again." William felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "What about the others?" 17 defendants total, sentences ranging from 15 years to life. The judge said it was the most comprehensive dismantling of an organized crime network she'd ever overseen. Rodriguez paused. "Dr. Thompson, I want you to know, what you did that night changed everything. Not just for Emma and Rex, but for hundreds of victims who are alive and free today because you chose to fight instead of hide." After the call ended, William found himself standing in the living room where it had all begun, holding Emma while she played with Rex's ears and babbled her mysterious toddler wisdom. Sarah joined them, wrapping her arms around his waist from behind, and for a moment they stood together in perfect silence, watching their daughter interact with the dog who had saved her life. "Do you think she'll remember any of this?" Sarah asked quietly. "The bad parts, I mean." William considered the question, watching Emma's face light up as Rex performed his trick of catching toy blocks in his mouth and gently returning them to her hands. "I think she'll remember love," he said finally. "She'll remember being protected, being chosen, being fought for. The rest will just be stories we tell her when she's old enough to understand." That evening, after Emma had been bathed and read to and tucked into her crib with Rex lying on the rug beside her, William and Sarah sat on their front porch watching the sunset paint the Maine sky in shades of gold and amber. The grandfather clock inside chimed 9 times, marking another day in a life that had learned to measure time not in losses but in moments of connection. "Margaret would have loved her," William said suddenly, surprising himself with the words. It was the first time he'd spoken his first wife's name without pain, the first time he'd been able to imagine her blessing on this new family they'd built from the fragments of tragedy. Sarah took his hand, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of two people who had chosen each other not despite their scars but because of them. "She would have loved all of us," she said, "including Rex. Especially Rex." Inside the house, Emma's soft breathing mixed with Rex's gentle snores, the sound of peace earned through struggle and protected by love. The grandfather clock ticked steadily onward, no longer marking time lost, but time given, time cherished, time that moved forward with purpose and hope. And in the growing darkness of a Maine evening, 4 souls who had found each other in the depths of winter continued their journey together into whatever seasons lay ahead, bound not by the accidents of birth or circumstance, but by the deliberate choice to be family, to protect, to nurture, to love without condition or reservation. Some crossings change you, some crossings save you, and some, the most precious ones, you realize you were always meant to make, even when the path leads through darkness so deep you can't imagine light on the other side. But light always returns. Love always finds a way. And sometimes when you least expect it, hope comes to your door in the form of a wounded dog carrying a dying baby, asking not for salvation but offering it, reminding you that the capacity to save others is often the key to saving yourself. The story had come full circle, but the circle was no longer closed. It was open, expanding, ready to embrace whatever new chapters love would write. Sometimes, life hands us losses so profound we think we'll never breathe freely again. William Thompson thought his story ended the night he lost Margaret and Tommy on that icy road 3 years ago. He'd built walls around his heart, convinced that loving again meant risking devastation again. But that December night when Rex appeared with baby Emma, William discovered something our generation understands deeply. Family isn't always about blood. It's about showing up when someone needs you most. Rex had been broken by cruelty, Emma abandoned by tragedy, yet together they found their way to a man who needed saving as much as they did. William's grandfather clock had stopped at 3:47 a.m., frozen in trauma, until love taught him that time moves forward, not backward. At our age, we know that second chances don't come with guarantees, but they come with purpose. We've learned that healing doesn't erase scars. It transforms them into wisdom. Rex chose protection over self-preservation. William chose connection over isolation. Together, they proved that it's never too late to become the family someone desperately needs. Sometimes the very thing that breaks us becomes the thing that makes us whole again. Have you ever had a moment when an unexpected encounter completely changed your life's direction? What would you do if life offered you a chance to start over with people who needed you as much as you needed them? Share your story in the comments below. Someone needs to hear it today.